right. Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Insurance Board webinar today. As people are still signing in, I just want to say hello. We like to start on time. So I'd like to welcome you to our webinar. My name is Chad Cunningham, and I'm your Loss Control Director here at the Insurance Board. I want to welcome you to our time of learning with our topic, Sanctuary Legal Considerations for Faith Communities. Before our speaker starts, there are a couple guidelines I would like to review with you. One, this webcast will be recorded and uploaded to our online learning portion of the website for future viewing. You will receive an email with a document and with some links on it for your recommendations, but the slide deck will not be available for this webinar. I'd like to get that out of the way now, so some of you will be asking about that. So the slide deck will not be available. This will be available, though, within the next week or so after the webinar. These items will be available to you. The chat function has been turned off. However, we will use a question and answer function to collect questions, and then we will answer all the questions at the end of the webinar. So please ask them in the Q&A area. If you're wondering where the Q&A area is, if you look at the bottom toolbar of your screen, you should see a button there that says QA. That's where we will be performing all of our questions and answers. All right, so today I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Heather Kimmel. Heather has served as the General Counsel of the United Church of Christ since 2015. In that capacity, she regularly counsels the corporations of the national ministries and the conferences on issues related to governance, religious liberty, intellectual property, tax, employment, and ecclesiastical oversight processes. Before joining the national ministries, she practiced in 2 large law firms in Cleveland. She frequently speaks on church law related matters and maintains a blog that is very, very good. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our friend here at the Insurance Board, Heather Kimmel. Heather, the stage is yours.
Thanks, Chad, and thanks to the Insurance Board for giving me the time and the space to speak on this important issue today. I'm going to go ahead and start share my slides. As Chad mentioned, the slide deck isn't going to be available for separate download, but the recording will be available, so you'll have access to the whole recording that way. And Chad, you'll let me know if the screen is looking good the way we talked about it. So looks like everything is good to go. So before I start, I need to offer the disclaimer. And if you've seen my presentations in the past, you know that I always offer this. This presentation is informational. It's not legal advice for your church's specific situation, and there's no attorney-client relationship between me and your church. If you do have a legal question about your particular circumstances, you should consult an attorney. If you are viewing this presentation and you think that someone else would benefit by viewing it, please direct them to the Insurance Board's online learning site to view the recording. And please don't provide like screen captures or anything like that of my slides. We want to make sure that people have complete information. And while the information on the slides is good, it's not complete, because the real importance is in the words that I'm saying that aren't necessarily part of the slides. So I thank you in advance for your cooperation with that. So if you're viewing this webinar live, it is January 16th of 2025. The presidential transition hasn't occurred yet. So it might seem like this webinar is a bit premature given that new policies haven't been enacted. And many of you may have viewed a webinar that I did for the Insurance Board on sanctuary ministries several years ago. And we're going to talk about some of those same issues today. But we thought that it was prudent to do this now, even though we have a lot of uncertainty about what is coming. The incoming federal administration has stated that it's going to focus on deporting undocumented immigrants. So we can certainly anticipate that greater federal resources are going to be directed to that goal. At the end of December of last year, several news organizations reported that the incoming administration intends to end what is called the sensitive locations policy. That policy, which we will talk more about in a few minutes, provided some degree of comfort to churches, schools, and hospitals that limits immigration enforcement in those locations without certain approvals. So in the wake of that announcement, many folks began reaching out to me and reaching out to the insurance board with questions about what's going to happen, what can we do? There are other stories in the news about faith communities and faith-based organizations strategizing about resistance and how to continue to serve folks amidst policy change. In fact, I was reading Religion News. If you go to religionnews.com, I was reading that today, and there is a story on there about the organizing group Faith in Action and its involvement in a multi-faith effort to strategize about these issues. So we're seeing news stories about how people will be impacted, and we're seeing news stories about how faith communities are going to come together to help continue to serve those who are impacted and to resist against that change. I certainly don't have all the answers. I may not even have any great answers today, but we can examine some new and some renewed risks of engaging in sanctuary ministries just so that folks are better prepared to deal with those. And if you are here because your church is feeling called to engage in sanctuary ministries for the first time, we'll have some valuable information for you as well. So we'll start out with talking about what is sanctuary. There's no legal definition of sanctuary because it's not a legal concept in the United States. The traditional meaning of sanctuary was that a person could seek refuge in a church from law enforcement, and that while a person was sheltered by a church, that person couldn't be apprehended by law enforcement. That it comes from a medieval concept, and that doesn't really have a modern counterpart in the United States. What people mean in the United States when they talk about sanctuary has also really changed over the years. Some faith communities were engaged in the work of concealing undocumented immigrants from immigration enforcement agencies in the 1980s, and that work was called sanctuary. Today, some cities are using the term sanctuary city to mean that they will not use their own resources to do the federal immigration agency's job of enforcing immigration laws. In other words, they're not going to help apprehend undocumented immigrants who have not otherwise violated the law. And then some other faith communities are using the term sanctuary to describe the way they minister to immigrant communities. So this may range from being a faith community that is welcoming to all, regardless of immigration status, to concealing undocumented immigrants who have deportation orders from law enforcement agents. So it can really encompass that broad range of ministry there. Faith communities may also differ in immigrant communities that they're serving or seeking to serve. Some faith communities offer services to persons who have some type of status and that they've been processed by the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, and they're maybe awaiting a hearing, but they don't have a deportation order. Some faith communities offer services to immigrants who are refugees, and some are offering services to persons who are just completely outside the system altogether. So because of the definition of sanctuary and the communities that we're serving can vary so widely, that is definitely going to affect a faith community's legal risk in engaging in the work. So for purposes of this webinar, our discussion of sanctuary ministries today applies to ministries that are assisting immigrants, which may include, but are not necessarily limited to, providing food, clothing, housing, employment assistance, medical assistance, legal assistance, and financial assistance. And the individuals who are served by these ministries, they may be undocumented, they may be asylum seekers, they may be refugees, or they may have some other legal status. So we're going to try to look at sanctuary ministries very broadly today. So when we talk about what the legal risks are of engaging with the sanctuary, in a sanctuary ministry, we look at it both from the perspective of our faith communities, but we're also morally compelled to examine the risk from the perspective of the users of those ministries. So that means we have a moral duty to make sure that everyone understands that ministries provided by a faith community can afford no legal protection to undocumented immigrants, including to the individuals who are being served. These folks are some of the most vulnerable in our population. They're making decisions about that could really impact the trajectory of their lives. We need to ensure that they're making these decisions not based on incomplete or misleading information about how our ministries can assist them, or operating under a false impression that faith communities can provide any legal protection from enforcement efforts. So if your faith community operates in sanctuary activities, ensure that there's no miscommunication about legal protections, which churches can't provide to undocumented immigrants. There's no law also that prohibits immigration enforcement actions or any other law enforcement actions from taking place in a house of worship. Churches don't have special protection under the law. This can be relevant not just for churches engaged in sanctuary ministries, but churches that have members who are immigrants or who are in an area with a lot of immigrants. There is a policy currently that does give some measure of comfort to churches that immigration enforcement actions won't be conducted there without certain prior approvals. We're going to talk about that. But as we also discussed previously, that policy appears like it's going to be rescinded with the incoming administration. So let's talk about two policies that could be affected with the incoming administration. So given the incoming administration's focus on undocumented immigrant removal, which has been stated ad nauseum, we can anticipate that any executive branch policies that limit authority to identify and deport undocumented immigrants may be ended. I think that's a pretty reasonable assumption. The sensitive locations policy is one such policy, and news outlets have reported in December that Trump's administration is going to end this policy. So the policy limited immigration enforcement in houses of worship, schools, hospitals, at religious ceremonies, and at public demonstrations without getting prior approval first. This policy is a good idea because in general, we want people to seek medical care when they're sick or injured. We want them to seek an education for their children, and freedom of religious exercise for all is a quintessential American value. So the policy is a really good policy. So it's devastating that this may be ended. So an ICE enforcement action, which may also sometimes be called a raid, it might jeopardize the safety of folks who are not targets of the immigration action. So it makes sense that if ICE is going to conduct an immigration enforcement action in one of these places, which tends to be filled with many, many people that are coming from all different locations and might not have a lot to do with one another, that should be for a very good reason. So under the sensitive locations policy currently, ICE can conduct an enforcement action in one of these places without prior approval if what is called exigent circumstances exist. So threats of national security or terrorism, an imminent risk of death, violence, or physical harm to person or property, the apprehension of a dangerous felon or a suspect or any other dangerous individual, or the imminent risk of destruction of evidence in an ongoing criminal case. So those were the exigent circumstances that did not require prior approval for ICE to conduct an enforcement action in the sensitive location. This sensitive locations policy it's always been subject to revocation or replacement, and there isn't really a right of action, which means the right to sue if ICE deviates from this policy. So if ICE violated its own policy, it would be very hard to hold them accountable, for an individual to hold them accountable for that. If this policy is terminated, which we think it will be, prior approval or the existence of exigent circumstances will no longer be required to conduct a raid at a house of worship, a school, or a hospital. We don't know if the incoming administration is going to enact other policies that limit such actions, or whether terminating the policy means that ICE is going to target these locations for enforcement generally. We just don't know yet. In the past, ICE has really focused on jails as places to find undocumented immigrants who've been arrested for committing other crimes. There isn't an indication that the government plans to specifically target churches for immigration enforcement. But I feel like I can't say this enough during this webinar. We don't know. We don't know. We don't know what's coming. We do know that if there is going to be a change, it is going to require the significant redeployment of resources from, one area of the government to another. In other words, they're going to have to spend a lot more money and hire a lot more people in order to carry out these mass deportation policies. The other policy I want to talk about is the prosecutorial discretion policy. So at one time, immigration officials had the discretion to focus the enforcement of immigration laws on individuals who posed a risk of terrorism or who had been convicted of crimes involving gang activity or other felonies. This meant that resources were focused on removing dangerous individuals or those who committed crimes and not as much on other undocumented immigrants. These guidelines were rescinded several years ago. The prosecutorial discretion guidelines issued since then were subject to challenge, and they've recently been in a state of flux, with a memo that was issued in 2023 providing some prosecutorial discretion. It's not clear how the incoming administration is going to limit prosecutorial discretion. If officials don't have some discretion and some guidelines on how to prioritize, they may be required to prosecute every case of undocumented immigration or not prioritize prosecutions of people who pose a high risk. It seems counterproductive and it seems like it would be a huge burden on government resources. But again, the administration may decide to spend a lot more money in this area, and we just don't know for sure. What we do know is that the incoming administration is focused on undocumented immigrants, and many faith communities see immigration as a justice issue and are called to minister to migrants. So we know both of those things. So this work is not without some risk. And we're going to talk now about how the federal law and the penalties, and then we'll talk about what higher risk activities are for faith communities and what lower risk activities for faith communities are. Some actions relating to undocumented immigrants are defined as federal crimes. So bringing an undocumented immigrant into the United States carries a prison term of up to 10 years for each undocumented immigrant. Concealing, harboring, shielding from detection, transporting, and/or encouraging an undocumented immigrant to remain in the United States carries a prison term of up to 5 years for each undocumented immigrant, unless it's done for commercial or financial personal or commercial financial gain, in which case the penalty is up to 10 years in prison. So that's human trafficking, essentially. So it's important to note that conspiracy or the planning to commit any of these crimes, even if the crime isn't completed, carries with it a prison sentence of up to 10 years. Aiding and abetting any of these crimes carries with it a prison sentence of up to 5 years. So the prison sentences for these crimes can be increased up to 20 years if a person is seriously injured or if a person's life is jeopardized during the crime, and the crimes are punishable by life in prison or the death penalty if a person loses their life during the crime. So each of these offenses is punishable by a fine as well. The amount of the fine, as well as the actual length of any prison term, is going to depend upon the judge's application of the federal sentencing guidelines, which takes into account a defendant's criminal history as well as other factors. So obviously a faith community or a church as a business can't be imprisoned, but it can be subject to criminal prosecution resulting in fines, and the officers and executive employees of those faith communities may be subject to individual criminal prosecutions for actions of the faith community. Individual faith community members who are engaged in providing certain sanctuary on behalf of a faith community, they could be prosecuted individually and receive fines and prison sentences. So these statutes cover potentially a broad range of behavior, especially the one that says encouraging an undocumented immigrant to remain in the United States. So I just want to be try to be a little bit more clear about that. Intent is a required element of these crimes that the government has to prove. So currently there's no case law holding that simply providing food or shelter to an undocumented immigrant is quote unquote encouraging that person to remain in the United States. So that does not seem to come under this law. Additionally, providing shelter to undocumented immigrants will likely not violate the statute without some intent to prevent law enforcement from apprehending that person. So there has been some recent case law that has held that the encouragement provision forbids only intentional solicitation and facilitation of unlawful acts. It doesn't apply to speech, except to the extent that that speech is integral to unlawful conduct. So you still have to have the unlawful conduct piece of that. With respect to the harboring statute, some courts have interpreted harboring to mean that it must be in secret, and other courts have interpreted it to mean giving shelter to, and have held that it doesn't necessarily need to be in secret. Some faith communities and other activist groups have tried to avoid the harboring statute by being very open about the fact that they're offering sanctuary to an undocumented immigrant with a deportation order, even through a press release or a letter to ICE. And we've seen several examples that have come up in the news and, just in your general church networks about churches who are housing undocumented immigrants with deportation orders, at their church, and that ICE knows that they're there. There's not a lot of case law about this. And in an environment with renewed attention to immigration, it's difficult to say how a strategy of being open about giving shelter to someone with a deportation order may play out in a church. Refusing to allow ICE to execute on a deportation order when ICE has the appropriate warrants will likely result in consequences for the church. So my intent in presenting this information is not to mislead you into thinking that faith communities and those engaged in this work are frequently prosecuted, because historically that is not the case. There's been some prosecutions of faith leaders and faith communities that occurred in the 1980s for concealing, smuggling, and transporting undocumented immigrants. Those defendants raised First Amendment or free exercise defenses to those charges that were unsuccessful at that time. So I can't tell you that your church is definitely going to be prosecuted or definitely won't be prosecuted if you engage in this, but I do need you to know that this is the law, and the penalties we discussed are the penalties for violating the law, because you can't make an informed decision about how you want to carry out your ministry unless you know what the risks are. But historically, churches and faith communities have not been prosecuted for engaging in these ministries. The legal landscape and the political climate are changing. It wouldn't be responsible to rely solely on past practices to assess current risk, which is why I bring this information to you today. Okay, so based on the law that we just reviewed, bringing undocumented immigrants into the United States or concealing immigrants from law enforcement is a high-risk activity. So those activities are clearly violations of federal law, and your faith community, its officers and directors and staff, or even volunteers, can be prosecuted for those actions. So we would consider things like bringing undocumented immigrants into the United States, concealing undocumented immigrants from law enforcement, or transporting undocumented immigrants in secret to prevent their existence or their whereabouts from being disclosed with the intent of concealing them from law enforcement would be what we would consider to be a high-risk activity. There are many, many ways that faith communities can engage in this ministry that are lower risk. The points on the side, I'm sorry, I'm starting to lose my voice. The points were provided by the ACLU a few years ago, and there is a link to that document that is still on the ACLU's website that I will provide in the resources document. So things like ministering to people regardless of their immigration status or citizenship, and providing food and housing to those in need without inquiring about immigration or citizenship status. Those are lower risk activities. Welcoming all to your faith communities without inquiring about immigration status, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or gender identity, you can make that a public statement and make it a policy of, adopt these principles as your policies. So for example, you can provide a food pantry, you can provide transitional housing, and those things can be done without inquiring as to immigration status. One question I received over the past month from a pastor was, if our faith community publicly declares itself to be a sanctuary faith community, will that open us up to greater scrutiny from law enforcement? So the answer is maybe, but declaring your faith community to be a sanctuary will not by itself result in prosecution. It can also be a really important social justice statement that continues to draw attention to the need for immigration policy reform. Remember that sanctuary has no legal definition, and there are no consistent requirements to be a sanctuary faith community. So saying that you are calling yourself a sanctuary faith community is not proof that you're engaging in any unlawful activity. So I don't think that that's a high risk activity. So other lower risk activities for faith communities are to host legal services clinics and refer to social services organizations for everyone that your faith community serves. Providing shelter and services to immigrants who've already been processed by the government and thus have some legal status. And I know there are some churches who have a close relationship with the federal government and the agencies that oversee that, and will often be resources for those agencies when they need to house folks and can provide that support to them. And then engaging in acts of public witness in support of immigration reform also. So if your faith community has been engaging in sanctuary ministries, you have probably already considered all the concerns that you have as we are moving for, kind of closer to the next presidential administration. I also know that there are some faith communities that may be newly called to devote their resources to that work. If that's why you're here, I really encourage you to first determine who in your community is already doing this work and how your church might be able to assist. There are many experienced organizations, including churches, who are already engaged, who can tell you what the needs are and give you wisdom about how to meet those needs in a way that best serves those to whom you are ministering. I don't want to be overly harsh, but you want to avoid being the newcomer organization that causes unwelcome attention, either from the government or otherwise, to the ministry because you misstepped and didn't have the information that you needed to engage in the activity that you were engaging in. So you might want to consult with national organizations like Church World Service. There are many experienced regional organizations as well, including your regional office of the ACLU, who can probably help you with that. You can talk to other churches who are engaged in this ministry, who know kind of what they are doing and who can help you get the lay of the land as to the things that you need to be paying attention to. But now is not the time to go it alone in starting to offer this ministry. And I've gotten a lot of questions about this as well over the past several weeks. What do you do if ICE shows up at your church? If your faith community serves immigrants or even has many immigrant members, it's worth the time and the money to work with a local community or legal group to do a know your rights training for staff or for key volunteers that are frequently present at your house of worship. This is not that training. So I'm just hitting the highlights here, but I would encourage you to do that if this is a concern that you have that ICE may show up at your church. First, now is the time to develop a plan and to train your staff and volunteers. Not after the resources that have already been reallocated and we have, many more ICE agents. Not then. Now is the time to do that. You have to develop a plan that works for your church and to make sure that all folks who are relevant in these ministries are trained on it. Some points you may consider including in your training plan are training staff or volunteers who may be present in the church not to give ICE permission to enter private areas, not to answer ICE's questions, and to remain attentive to what ICE is doing, either by taking notes or by filming them if those folks feel comfortable doing that. You should also consider identifying an immigration attorney that you can call or that your staff can call if ICE does show up. Because that is, when that happens, that is not the time to be finding someone who can assist you. So ICE agents, and I apologize, I should have done an acronym slide, were Immigrations and Customs Enforcement. Well, ICE agents can enter a public area of a church if one exists without a warrant. They can't just start detaining people and talking to them without more. ICE agents can't enter private areas of a church without a judicial warrant, and that is a warrant from a court that is signed by a judge. It is not the same as an administrative warrant from the Department of Homeland Security or another government agency that may have an individual's name on it that they are authorized to detain. Okay, they need a warrant from a court in order to get into private areas without permission. Whether an area of your church is public or private depends on how the space is used day to day. You could consider putting signs on doors that say private for non-public spaces. So if there are areas of your church that are typically open to the public during the day, or that the public can just come in, for example, like a lobby, that is probably going to be an okay area for ICE to enter. So if there are particular areas of your church that you believe need protected, you should put signs on the door that say private. Again, I would highly encourage you in terms of making your plan for what to do if ICE shows up at your church, is to contact probably the regional branch of your ACLU would be a great place to start, and to try to do a know your rights training with them. Right. So these are some additional resources that I have put together, and these links will go out in a resources document when this webinar is posted. I would encourage you to read these. The first one, the ACLU, Sanctuary Congregations and Harboring. If you are at all considering whether your ministry is called to offer housing to undocumented immigrants or support them, then I would really recommend that document. It is a few years old. It hasn't been updated, but it's excellent, and you should read that. Church World Service is engaged in refugee resettlement and asylum services. Its website is also a great resource. The National Immigration Law Center, What to Do if Immigration Comes to Your Workplace. It is an excellent resource. The website is full of excellent resources. Your denomination is also a great resource for becoming an immigrant welcoming congregation. So I've linked to the UCC Immigrant Welcoming Congregation website, and also the Presbyterian Church, PCUSA, Sanctuary, a Discernment Guide for Congregations. Those not only are valuable information, but they also have links to many other organizations who are already engaged in doing this work, which, as I stated before, I think is critical if you are newly starting out in this. I'm going to stop sharing these slides now. And Ched, I think we have time for some questions. Which we can move into if you are ready for that.
I am ready.
Okay.
Excellent job. Thank you very much, Heather. Appreciate all of that. We do have some questions. And the first question I want to ask is, we got it from a couple of participants, is can you define the terms public area versus private area? So the difference between those two, please.
Yeah, it's a very lawyer answer, because I'm going to say it depends. It depends on how that space of your church is being used. So if people cannot get into your church without ringing a doorbell, waiting to be let in, if the door to your church is marked private, if it's locked all the time, ICE is not going to be able to come in there. If your door to your church is unlocked and there are spaces that are open to the public, it's more likely that that is going to be considered a public area, but it really is a case-by-case analysis.
Excellent, thank you. Second question that came over. When someone has filed paperwork but did not have a hearing yet, are they considered as in the system or legal?
So that's a great question. And I don't know that it's a great question for me because I'm not an immigration lawyer. There's a lot of intricacies there. But if they are in the system, and the system is aware of them, I guess they would be in the system.
Mhm.
I don't know that that makes them legal because they don't have a legal right to be in the United States.
All right, very good. And then this one, is it automatically concealing or harboring simply to house someone in church, or do you have to be more active in the concealment for it to count as that being concealing or harboring?
Yeah, so that gets really into, what is the crime of harboring? And there have been courts who have gone one way on that to say that any kind of giving shelter to, even if the church is open about it, is harboring. And then other courts have said that no, it has to be intentional concealment, and preventing law enforcement from getting to those folks. That would be the harboring. So the question is, in my mind, the question is, how would that be ruled on by a judge today in this environment? And I think that's the question that we need to ask, because there is case law that goes both ways. So I think it is a legal risk either way.
Okay, excellent. And that kind of answered our other one, just basically looking at, and I think here, looking at an immigration lawyer would be there too, but if they're going through the legal asylum process, are they still considered undocumented? And I'm guessing by what you said before, that would be yes, they're still undocumented until it's at the end of that system.
Yeah. So for those kinds of situations, I would really encourage a church to contact an immigration attorney as to what the specific status of the individual they're considering ministering to is, so that the church has clarity on that. It's really hard for me to say, sitting here without the details, what that would be. So in any instance, if a church wants to assess its risk, they should probably speak with an immigration attorney.
Question came through here. Is there any advantage to using the term refugee as opposed to sanctuary or refuge? Sorry, I was reading two at the same time. A refuge compared to sanctuary.
I'm going to make some assumptions in answering this question. I'm going to assume that the questioner wants to know whether there's like a legal advantage, or whether there's an advantage of it not drawing the attention of folks that we don't want to draw the attention of. So perhaps, ICE, if we use refuge instead of sanctuary. I don't think it makes a difference. But that's a decision that they can make. The use of the word sanctuary versus refuge, that's a speech issue. All that is doing is talking. That is not doing. That is not proof of any activity that you're engaged in. It's certainly not proof of unlawful activity. So I would say whatever that the church, prefers or could call, feels called to use, would be, a term that they could use.
Excellent. So this is one. If we have a policy of don't ask, don't tell about immigration status, not asked in any questionnaire, what do we have to be careful of with implementation?
Okay, so I think that policies where your church is going to serve everyone, regardless of immigration status, or perhaps any other status, those are great. Because that just says what that does really is, like, it takes intent out of it with respect to immigration status, right? It's not like you would know that they are undocumented immigrants. So you can't intend to be providing services to undocumented immigrants that you should not otherwise be providing. So I think in terms of what do we need to pay attention to in implementation, is just to make sure that that is actually what you're doing. Are you serving everyone regardless of their immigration status? And that it's not a policy that is said but not enforced.
Very good. So here's one, and we have, many churches who rent space out to different organizations. This question comes that they rent space out to a Hispanic congregation. Would our congregation be responsible if they harbor someone?
Well, I mean, I don't know. That is not the thing. So whenever a church says we rent space to someone, there are all kinds of questions that I have, what does that relationship look like? Is it set up under some type of written agreement? Are there, waivers, et cetera? In general, you should not be responsible for the acts of another organization unless you are somehow responsible for that organization itself, but I can't say specifically.
Excellent. Here's one I'm not sure. I'm going to throw it to you, but you can punt this one too, because I don't know if it's in your bill back there. If ICE comes to your church with the wrong papers, what do we do? Ask them to leave?
So let me make an assumption here. I'm going to assume that ICE is showing up with maybe not a judicial warrant to get into the church. Maybe they just have an administrative warrant with perhaps someone's name on it. And the church is not required to take them to that person. So if they want to get into a private area and they don't have the particular papers that they need, yes, you can tell them to come back with a judicial warrant.
Okay.
And that, by the way, that takes a lot of guts. So, and that's one of the reasons it's really important to do a training and plan for that. Those trainings can give folks scripts of what to say if that happens, and exactly what to do if that happens. So that's part of having a plan to train your staff and your volunteers on what to do if that happens.
Excellent. Thank you. Reading through a couple of these, we're getting them kind of as we talk. Would it be legally helpful for churches providing actual sanctuary if every church in the denomination publicly declared themselves as a sanctuary church?
Mm-hmm. So again, I'm going to make a couple of assumptions in answering that question, and that is seeming to rely on a First Amendment defense. Like, this is our freedom of religion; it's our religious value to provide this kind of service, and that has not been a successful defense in the past, in the 80s. I also noted that today I saw an article about an organization in Texas that is being prosecuted under Texas law. The Texas Attorney General is trying to shut it down for engaging in those types of activities, although the organization says it only works with folks who are here legally. So the religious beliefs are not an excuse, are not a defense to a crime, generally in that instance, from what we've seen in the case law.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Where did it go? So do you have any advice for this participant? And it kind of gets into a couple questions we've had, combining them here. How about for individual church members that would want to provide housing in their own home for an undocumented person who feels threatened or has this undocumented aspect? Is there any fallback that would affect them on their home compared to our churches?
So I think that's a difficult question to answer. If the assumption is that ministry is being run through the church in some way, then that individual, that church is could be liable as well. The individual certainly would be if they were otherwise found to commit one of those crimes that we talked about that were related to immigration. There's a civil forfeiture law that we didn't talk about that also allows the government to seize modes of transportation that are used to engage in those crimes. So that might be something that an individual would be concerned about. But in general, whether an individual does it or whether an organization does it, it's still a crime.
Thank you. And you actually answered the other one that was coming up about transportation. So
yeah,
kind of hits in that.
Yeah, but remember, there has to be some intent involved, like an intent to keep that person out of, away from being apprehended. If you have a church that is, that provides transportation to everyone, regardless of immigration status, or you have a ministry that provides rides to medical appointments, or a ministry that provides rides to court appointments or something like that, the intent is going to be hard to prove. But again, new climate, new ways of thinking about these things.
So difference on warrants. Are you big on the difference between administrative warrants and the other styles of warrants? I only ask that, how about they just have an administrative warrant, ICE? Can we deny them access to enter the building?
You can deny them access to enter private areas.
Yep. Okay. We will take a couple more here, because I know she will not say this, but I will say this to everyone. Ms. Kimmel's been under the weather this week, and her voice has been going in and out, so I want to be honest of that. So, all right, here's one. Does proximity to national borders affect any of the guidance you shared in terms of ICE jurisdiction, knowing this includes East and West Coast, not just borders with Mexico and Canada?
Does proximity to the borders affect
the information you provided?
The information I provided. So I think there's probably considerations to be taken for the geographic area that you're in, but I don't think it affects the validity of any of the information that I shared. I think one of the things we can think about is where are communities that have many immigrants? Do those tend to be located in those areas? Is a community with many immigrants going to be more of a focus for an immigration enforcement action? I think the answer to that is yes, and I think that can, that the propensity for that may increase with the incoming administration. So in that way, yes.
And I think you've answered this one, but I just want to swing back to it just in case. So a lot of the laws we talk about is federal, because that's where ICE basically comes from. But are there any state laws that you're aware of that people should be aware of? Or I think more or less resources maybe that they could go to and look for that?
So federal law preempts state law in matters of immigration. I think that's the best I can say about that. And then folks who are interested in knowing about whether their state or their local city has any provisions like being a sanctuary city should really check with local groups who will have their pulse on that. I know that in some cities, some sanctuary cities, folks, those cities will refuse to use their resources to help ICE conduct immigration enforcement actions, and that would probably be really beneficial for faith communities in that city to know. So I would encourage you to reach out to local groups on that.
Excellent, thank you. Let's see, ones. So when we look at again going back to the concept of private and public, and I think this one's kind of important to understand that. Somebody asked, can we put a private sign on the church to make the whole church private?
Yeah, so I think it depends more on how that area is being used day to day than it does on the sign that you have on the door. If you put a private sign on your door, but that door is unlocked and people can come in and out of it all day long, without monitoring or permission, that's not a private area, regardless of the private sign on your door. The advice to put a private sign on areas of your church that are private are to prevent people from thinking those might be public areas and going into them. It's not an end run around kind of the notion that ICE can enter public areas. So just to be clear on that.
Excellent. And we've had a lot of questions asking about training. You talked about training your congregation and how to respond. And I don't know if it will be in the links that you will be providing, but do you have any training concepts or resources to assist in that area, please?
So my recommendation would be to reach out to the most local branch of the ACLU and see what they say. Or if you have an immigration focused legal clinic in your area, I'm sure they would be happy to help arrange a training. Those can be great resources as well. If you have other immigration focused organizations or churches who are already doing this work in that area, they can provide you resources. That generally tends to need to be a local thing to do. So I don't have resources that can help do that, kind of across the board. But it's, I like, if folks take away one thing from this training, is that if you are engaged in these ministries, please do train your staff on what to do if ICE shows up. Not just for, not just to prevent ICE from taking, improper action, but to give your staff that comfort and that confidence to be able to say, oh, no, actually, I'm sorry, you can't come in. That's a really hard thing to do in the face of folks who may be, dressed like police officers, may look very intimidating. So I would just really encourage, that type of training and some role playing and some scripts to be formulated for that.
And I think with a matter of time, we'll end it there. If we did not get to your question, I apologize due to time. But I will say that if you have questions, go ahead and you can email those to me at C Cunningham. So Chad Cunningham or C Cunningham at insuranceboard.org, and we will try to get those questions back to you. And I know that some questions have been coming up on about insurance based. How does sanctuary and how does this affect our insurance and our D&O coverage? And really, do you know there'd be a coverage issue if the volunteers were judicially determined to have broken the law? So again, it's what Heather was stating. What's the intent? Is it knowingly? Under our general liability, there still could be a coverage issue if it excludes coverage for intentional acts. So if you're intentionally, again, as Heather stated, doing these acts in sanctuary with breaking the law, there could be some coverage challenges there. But many times it's a case-to-case basis on what that is. But if you have questions, feel free to email me, again, at ccunningham@insuranceboard.org, and we will get those answers for you. All right. So Heather, again, thank you very much for your time and expertise in this field. We appreciate it always. And we hope your voice gets a little stronger as the week goes by after this. So thank you very much.